Are mass deportations or deportations at all moral? This is a question that is on many people's minds as Donald Trump enacts his immigration agenda, which has included, up until the date of this video, deporting criminal migrants and also generally undocumented migrants from the country. Has also included taking a very hardline stance on notions of citizenship and national identity as relates to who reside within our nation. And the critics of these moves, and the critics more generally of deporting what they call undocumented immigrants, have said that it is inhumane, it is cruel, and they have used arguments from sentiment to continue to buttress their case. So in this video, I asked the question, which I'll be taking the affirmative answer to: are deportations moral? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I'll be walking you through my arguments as to why I believe that any society that is going to sustain itself, any society that is going to be both moral and is both responsible to their citizens, is going to have to undertake some level of deportations as a means of ensuring that happens. And so I'll walk you through all of this, and I will explain how President Trump's immigration policies writ large are furthering not just a end that enforces the rule of law, so to speak, but also an end that also enforces moral law as well. Before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Moss. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with the philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message remains out there. We are almost at 20,000 subscribers. I'm very excited, my friends. If you wish to help me get to that goal, then you can, of course, leave a like. You can, of course, comment, but the algorithm likes both of those things as well. If you want to help me a little bit more beyond that, you can also send in a donation. Not obligated, of course, but that also is nice to ensure that I can keep giving you high-quality content. Thank you guys so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, President Trump's immigration agenda has perhaps been one of the most revolutionary, and I would even say unprecedented, in recent years. He has undertaken several actions towards immigration since he got into office, as of the posting of this video a few weeks ago. Some of those actions being signing the Lanken Reilly Act to ensure that undocumented immigrants that commit crimes have a harsher and more resolute stance against them. Some of them have also been having more daily arresting more criminal migrants in the country than several of his predecessors combined. The highest number of daily arrests that happened under his predecessors happened under Barack Obama, who arrested 636 migrants per day. Donald Trump so far has arrested 973 migrants per day as of the latter end of January, which brings the total amount of criminal migrants, these are people with criminal records, arrested upwards close to 6,000 people. He's also, of course, authorized ICE to go against the gang Tren de Aragua, which actually on this channel we've covered is actually not just a criminal gang, but it's also a Venezuelan operation serving at the direct behest of Maduro, who is using it as an influence operation in the country. Well, he's rounded up hundreds of those, and he has sent them over to Guantanamo Bay to be held in case they posed future danger. So he is taking a very aggressive stance. And speaking of Guantanamo, the president himself has announced that that he has secured 30,000 beds in Guantanamo in the event that countries that the immigrants are being deported back to, or are supposed to be reported back to, do not wish to take them. And he's also had tense negotiations with countries like Colombia, who didn't want to really take back their migrants because they complain that the migrants were sent back in horrible conditions. India is actually complaining about the same thing, although the very interesting thing is that these countries are more upset that their people are being sent back for trespassing against our laws more than they are against the fact that their own people didn't have the learning or the desire to respect the laws of a different country. That would, in my opinion, be a much more worthy expense of drawing your rebuke than having them sent back in a way you don't like. But I digress. Case in point, this president has perhaps been one of the most radically sort of pro-citizenship, pro-nation, and pro-sensible immigration presidents I've seen in a very long time. But this video is not about necessarily President Trump's policies, more than it is about the sort of issues surrounding deportation and how that impacts immigrants who are already in the country. There's been a lot of different outcry about what more generally the sort of deportations have done. There's been outcry from popular people like Selena Gomez. I will not go into her reaction because I think it's really just rage bait and it doesn't really make any difference to the topic. But there's also been outcry to people who were upset that Venezuelans and Haitians and Nicaraguans and other immigrants who were here under temporary protected status are going to possibly be sent back as well, given President Trump's decision to suspend that program. And for those of you who do not know, temporary protected status was what happens when people come from a country that has either a national disaster or some kind of political instability, and they are given a short-term stay in this country, until they go back to their country, till their country's situation has settled, or until this country itself has decided that their situation is good enough for them to go back. Well, President Trump is ending that status, which started under the Biden administration, which is causing a lot of people, including on the pro-immigrant, so to speak, right, to condemn him and to say that he is being bad and to condemn the idea of deportations more generally. So, the question before us today, given all of these events, is, are mass deportations somehow inhumane? Are they somehow immoral? Or are they actually a sort of moral necessity for a free society to have? I argue that they most definitely are. So as we begin to analyze this question, we must first establish a definition of what the word moral actually means, because many of us use the word coyly, or we use the word to simply describe things that give us taste or give us distaste, which is an improper use of the word moral. We have to understand that morality is a science, and that there is an objective way to assess any and every moral question. All moral questions are at first questions about behavior, and they are questions about how behavior interacts with a particular set of rules. Deportation itself is actually a response to a certain kind of behavior. If a country is removing you from their country to send you back from another country, it is generally a response to A, you being there illegally, which is a certain kind of behavior, i.e. you breaking the law, B, you committing some kind of violent crime in the country, or some kind of crime in general in the country, while also being there illegally, or C, some other enumerated purpose. But deportation is always, generally always, a response to a particular kind of behavior. So, morality is actually tied up with the topic itself. It's not distinct, it's not pie in the sky, it's actually quite relevant here. Secondly, the common refrain that I have seen against mass deportations, especially against those who have temporary protected status, those who came here from countries that had a bad political climate like Venezuela and who could possibly be sent back, is that it is inhumane or cruel to uproot people who have jobs in the country, who have particular economic ties in the country, who may even have family in the country, who have stayed here and have contributed. It is wrong to send them back to whence they came. But the problem with these kinds of arguments is that they assume an incorrect set of premises. They conflate sentiment with moral conduct. If morality is a science, and it is a science that is dictated by particular rules, then that must mean that sentiment, emotions take a back seat when assessing how those rules apply to particular kinds of actions. Let me give you a very workable example of this before we move on. So, for example, if there is a moral rule that says that it is wrong to steal, well, it does not matter if the person stealing happens to be a generally charitable soul who gives 50% of their earnings to charity, or who helps people in their everyday lives. In that particular context, what matters is their actions went against a rule, and by doing so, not only did it cause a harm to somebody else indisputably, but it also caused a violation of that general rule by which, without that rule, society cannot really exist. Because ethics simply are rules that exist to maintain society by imposing limits on behavior. That's all ethics are. So it does not matter if that particular person intends to be a kind person generally, or if they are in a bad situation. What matters is their conduct. Now, for a court proceeding or some kind of secondhand matter, it may very well matter what their kind of character is, but to the general matter of the event, it does not matter whatsoever. That's one thing. Second thing, sentiment and emotions are not morally intelligible. Meaning I cannot take something substantive out of how I feel beyond the fact that I feel a certain way, beyond the fact that something within my lizard brain has triggered a particular reaction that is now moving me towards a particular emotion. But in order to go beyond that and achieve understanding, achieve meaning, and achieve moral righteousness, I must get beyond my own self. I must do, as Adam Smith said in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, embody this sort of impartial observer, and I must be able to assess actions independent of my biases. Those who mix sentiment and sound arguments together are those who are allowing their thinking to be captured by their biases, to be captured by their passions, and therefore limiting the ability for their thinking to reach towards the truth. So, whenever somebody says it is cruel to deport somebody, you're simply allowing your biases to inform your views on a topic that go way beyond them, and by doing that, you are limiting your understanding of the topic. I also want to talk about this idea of weaponized sentiment, right? So, for example, I'll mention very briefly the Selena Gomez example that I gave all of you, of her crying when she was talking about deportations, which, by the way, most of these deportations are happening with criminal migrants, people that are in the country that have done bad things in the country, violent or nonviolent, or people who have come in the past few years, over millions of them, as stats have said, that are residing in the country and being a tax on the communities within our country, so on and so forth. She was crying that they were being deported, saying that her people were under attack. Well, the fact that she's crying says absolutely nothing about the particular situation at hand, other than the fact that somewhere in her mind, her emotions have convinced her this is an existential matter that deserves her sadness, right? But beyond that, we can't have, right? We can't have a kind of discourse that is healthy and substantive when all we are worried about is how somebody feels, or all we are worried about is being performative in our emotions. All we can have in those cases are theaters. And theaters are there to entertain you and capture the imagination. But beyond that, theaters don't really serve much of a purpose. And so I see weaponized sentiment, using tears as a manner to actually do a disservice to the people that are getting deported by concealing the reason why the deportations may have been actually quite necessary. We'll explore more about this in a second. But so, if morality is a science, then we must then establish that there is a relationship between the limits within our own conduct and the need for correction. Because limits that exist without being enforced are not very useful limits whatsoever. Deportations, as I mentioned, are the enforcements of the limits of people that decide to come into our country and people that decide to exist within our country. This is where I arrive at two central concepts that are going to help guide us through this conversation. The rule of law, which many of you know, but also the rule of moral conduct. Now, the first concept may be actually quite clear to many of you. The rule of law is simply the fact that the law in a country must be adhered to by its adherents, and it must be followed. And if it is to be changed and if it is to be addressed, it must be addressed through the proper channel enumerated within the structure of that country's government. It's the rule of law. But the rule of law is actually a secondary principle, because the law that is passed by government is not absolute. It is derivative, rather, of a higher source. The rule of law is ultimately a constituent to the rule of moral conduct. Because ultimately, what gives the rule of law legitimacy? First principles. And what legitimizes first principles? What legitimizes first principles is, in the abstract, your ability to reason, your ability to conform what is necessary, to conform proper conduct to your reason. In the concrete, a society with a strong, sound moral thinking is what legitimizes first principles in the rule of law. So this is where the rule of moral conduct comes in. The rule of moral conduct is more fundamental than the rule of law because the latter hinges entirely upon it. If someone, for example, if someone's existence within society reflects some level of dishonesty or illicit standing, it violates the rule of moral conduct and therefore makes that person injurious to sound ethics within that particular society. So, the rule of moral conduct is where the rule of law actually comes from. This is one of the reasons why I think deportations are actually necessary. Because if someone comes here illegally, whether it's with a family or by themselves, and they stay in the country, they take up its resources, and they exist outside of the parameters they were supposed to actually come in, it's not merely a matter of process. It's not merely a matter, rather, of them following the law. It's a matter of them being dishonest. Their presence, rather, in this country being dishonest, and that dishonesty creating friction within the society by deteriorating the standard of moral conduct. Immigration, migration, any action that puts you within somebody else's home cannot be undertaken without their explicit consent, number one, but it can also not be undertaken, even with their consent, with dishonesty, because dishonesty creates a bad standard within the society, and that undermines ethical conduct. So deportations, going back to that concept of limitations, deportations as a correction for the limits that are put upon society, the rule of moral conduct, the rule of law put upon society, are a necessary way to actually fix that issue without allowing it to grow out of control. This is why deportations are so important. Not just because they enforce the rule of law, but because they also enforce the rule of moral conduct, and they drive away the vices of one's presence within the country being a fundamentally negative thing. Another reason why deportations are actually quite necessary is because fidelity must be enforced for foreigners. What do I mean? All societies require fidelity. In fact, I argue right now that we are going through a fidelity crisis in this country, where there is where the kind of strong bonds that build community, where the sort of loyalty to national ideas, patriotism, the sort of reverence for certain icons and certain things within history, and the understanding of the country that comes with this, that builds these pre-political civic bonds, are deteriorating. They're deteriorating for many reasons. Number one, because there is an active effort within many of the institutions within society, especially the educational institutions, to teach a fundamentally anti-American message. But they're also deteriorating because the digital world is disembodying us and putting us into screens and putting us into sort of digital space. And by doing that, it's making actual human interaction not only more difficult, but almost damn near impossible without the aid of some kind of digital interface, and so on and so forth. But another contributor to the fidelity crisis is anything that breaks down social cohesion. And this is where immigration comes in, because massive amounts of migration, or I say migration because that's really what we're talking about here. Immigration implies a legal legitimacy, when in all reality what we're dealing with here are undocumented or illegal immigrants. Any kind of massive influx of foreign peoples causes a breakdown or a challenge of social cohesion, especially if those peoples do not assimilate. Now, if you're not willing to be in the country on moral terms, if you're not willing to be in the country on legal terms, if you've already established that your presence is dishonest in this country, how in the world can we expect you to assimilate the virtues of our country, one of which would be truth? One of the virtues of Americanism is truth, founded upon reason and observance of ethics. How can we expect or trust you to be involved in that if your presence here defies the sort of norms of the society? Well, your actions suggest that we can't. Now, by the way, these migrants may be very good people. They may be great people. But as I mentioned, them being a great person, or them being a nice person, or them being a vulnerable person does not excuse bad behavior, because character should be the prelude to good behavior. And when character is the prelude to bad behavior, all I have to go off of is your behavior. All I have to observe is your behavior. And so deportations actually come in as a way to preserve fidelity within the members of a particular society, because it can exile those that have come into the society on terms that explicitly violate fidelity. A society without fidelity is one that becomes rife with callousness and carelessness, and so on and so forth. And someone that has no care for the norms of a particular society has already shown themselves to be against Fidelity. John Locke made a very important point in the Secretaries of Government. John Locke said that a foreigner that comes into a commonwealth is simply a society, rather in the explicit term of commonwealth, which goes back to the Roman term civitas, basically just means a society of men bound by law, bound by some general norm. So any foreigner that comes within the society does not become a part of the society for John Locke. Instead, he simply is there and he must exist on the rules and terms of those who are allowing him to stay in the society. And if he does not, that person then has no legitimate standing within the society. Well, those that come illegally have already violated that principle from the offset, and therefore their standing is already questionable. And so this is very important. Fidelity is an essential glue to society, and that can't be risked. And if immigration tends towards, or rather if migration and mass migration and illegal migration tends towards this kind of bad condition, then it has to be corrected. Another sort of argument that we see when we deal with this issue is a sort of argument that reflects a wrong view of nationhood, reflects a rather utilitarian view of nationhood. So a utilitarian view of the nation simply views the nation as a means to an end. It views the nation as a means to an end rather than a holistic concept within itself. Because ultimately, a nation is simply a group of people united by certain ideas or principles. So in some countries, it's certain histories, certain lineages. In America, it's certain philosophies, certain axioms, certain worldviews that are found in the offset at the founding generation. And so, the utilitarian view of the nation basically says the nation simply exists to deliver positive results for those within it. And if that means those who came into the country in a desperate state, despite violating the rule of moral conduct and despite violating the rule of law, that then therefore means a nation must be made a tool for those, despite the fact that they violated norms. Because it's not a matter of upholding norms or ethics. It's rather a matter of what the nation can do to benefit someone's life. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people who are against ending temporary protected statuses are essentially saying that by doing so, it's causing a negative effect to those who are here temporarily. Well, the truth is simply this. As I mentioned a moment ago, those who are here temporarily are here under the conditions that were particularly laid out by our country, and they were here, their presence here was never meant to be permanent. In fact, their presence here was explicitly meant to be temporary or at the behest of the host country. And if your presence here is at the behest of the host country, it is not the host country's fault when they decide to send you off. It is, in fact, I would say, your fault if you did not have any contingencies in place during the time you were in the country that would account for you eventually being removed from the country. If I were to go to, for example, Venezuela, and I were there on a temporary visa, and I stay 90 days, my visa ends at the end of that 90 days, and they decide to kick me out, and I have a job there, and I have a community there, and I have friends there, are they being cruel for kicking me out? No. They are simply using their right as a country to govern their own territory, and looking at my status as a foreigner to send me back to my home country. When countries can't engage in self-governance, which is ultimately what the anti-deportation crowd is saying, then countries cannot effectively maintain themselves, preserve themselves, or defend the commonwealth that exists within it. Deportations, my friends, are not meant to be seen on a one-dimensional level. You must be able to see them on multiple levels. You must be able to see them as tools that ensure the bonds within civil society are preserved from outside forces. You must be able to see them as tools that enforce fidelity. You must be able to see them as tools that enforce the rule of moral conduct and the rule of law. You must be able to see them as tools that allow norms and expectations that we have of people who are foreigners to also be enforced well and quickly as well. When deportations are seen in this sort of multifaceted way, they go away from being this sort of scary thing to rather being a necessary tool, not necessarily evil, but a necessary tool that must be used if a country is to have any tangible way to defend itself. Deportations are simply an aggrandized form of national self-defense. And that is why they are most certainly a moral tool. And this is not necessarily an attempt to talk about the conditions that some of these migrants have been deported under. This is not a video to do that. Those are separate issues. This is rather a video to simply talk about the fact that just because you have a utilitarian view of the nation, just because you have a sort of humanitarian ethic about yourself, does not mean those things outrank the considerations of a nation and the considerations of moral principles that govern the existence of society. And so for those reasons, my friends, I humbly submit to you that deportations are most certainly a moral tool, and they are most certainly a necessary tool, especially as the world continues to march on into this very dangerous multipolar environment that we're in right now, and especially as state actors continue to try to find ways to exploit the weaknesses of America. We cannot let anything. We cannot let our compassion. We cannot let our sort of sympathy dominate us and put us in a position where we are allowing our enemies to get an open shot against us, or we are allowing our own resources to be drained when they are precious and scarce and should be used for purposes that preserve the nation most directly. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. If you want to help me, here is a list of links that would definitely help me if you would go to them and support me as well. My friends, study history, study philosophy, make more of it, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.